In the early 1920s, Belfast was a city on a knife edge, a place where tensions simmered just below the surface of daily life. In the middle of all this lived the McMahon family. They weren't politicians or activists. They were just an ordinary, respectable family trying to make their way. The head of the house was Owen McMahon, a man well known in the community. He was a successful publican, owning several popular pubs in the city, and he was also involved in the horse racing world. He was seen as a solid, middle-class Catholic man, a pillar of his community and someone who had earned his place through hard work and decency. He provided a good life for his wife and their many children in their home on Éire Terrace, just off the Antrim Road. The McMahon household was a busy one, full of life and the usual comings and goings of a large family. Owen and his wife Éire had raised a fine family of sons, many of whom were grown men by 1922. They were involved in their father's businesses, working in the pubs and helping to keep the family enterprises running smoothly. They were known around town not for any political leanings, but for being decent, hard-working lads. Their home was a comfortable one, a symbol of the success Owen had achieved. In a city where sectarian lines were sharply drawn, the McMahons represented a certain kind of Catholic aspiration, the ability to build a prosperous life through honest labour, to be respected, and to live peacefully among your neighbours. Their position, however, was a precarious one. As middle-class Catholics, they stood out. In a time of intense political and sectarian strife, success could make you a target. They were not known to be strongly political, certainly not in any way that would attract trouble from the authorities. Owen was what you might call a castle Catholic, a term for those who were not outspoken nationalists and preferred to work within the system. He was a man who believed in keeping his head down and getting on with things, a strategy that many felt was the safest course in such dangerous times. But in the Belfast of 1922, even neutrality was no guarantee of safety. Their very ordinariness was what made what happened next so shocking. The family's life on Éire Terrace was, by all accounts, a quiet one. They were part of the fabric of North Belfast, a mixed area, but one where everyone knew everyone else. Their story was one of upward mobility, of a family that had done well for itself. They were not revolutionaries or agitators. They were simply a family living their lives, caught in the crossfire of a conflict that was spinning out of control. Their home was a sanctuary, a place of warmth and security in a cold and dangerous city. But on a cold March night in 1922, that sanctuary would be violated in the most brutal way imaginable, and the McMahon name would become forever synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in Belfast's troubled history. The evening of March 23rd, 1922 began like any other for the McMahon family. The day's work was done, and the family members were gathered in their home on Éire Terrace. The city outside was tense, as it had been for months. The Irish War of Independence had officially ended, but in the newly formed state of Northern Ireland, a bitter and bloody sectarian conflict was raging. Murders were a grimly regular occurrence, but inside the McMahon house there was a sense of security. They were, after all, a family with no direct involvement in the violence. They had no reason to believe that the war raging on the streets would ever come crashing through their own front door. Sometime after 1 o'clock in the morning on March 24th, a loud, insistent knocking shattered the quiet of the night. It was the kind of knock that meant trouble, the sound of authority. When a voice from inside asked who was there, the reply came back, "Police." The men outside were dressed in the dark, heavy uniforms of the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police force of the time. Seeing the uniforms, the family would have felt a mix of fear and perhaps a reluctant sense of duty to cooperate. The police were a constant presence in the city, conducting raids and searches. There was little choice but to open the door and let them in to find out what they wanted. Once the door was unbolted, a group of about 5 men, their faces partially hidden, forced their way inside. They were armed with heavy sledgehammers and revolvers. The sledgehammers were used with brutal efficiency to smash down the internal doors, breaking into the rooms where the family members were sleeping. The men of the house, Owen, his sons, and an employee named Edward McKinney, who worked in their pub, were rounded up at gunpoint. They were herded from their beds into the dining room downstairs. The women in the house, including Owen's wife Eliza, were locked away in another room, their terrified pleas and questions ignored by the grim, silent intruders. The scene in the dining room was one of sheer terror. The McMahon men and Edward McKinney were lined up facing the intruders. There was no interrogation, no explanation, just a cold, methodical purpose. The leader of the gang, a man later described as having a particular accent, gave the orders. Without warning, the intruders opened fire with their revolvers, shooting the defenseless men at close range. The small room was filled with the deafening roar of gunshots, smoke, and the cries of the dying. The attack was over in a matter of minutes. The killers, their horrific work complete, then slipped back out of the house and vanished into the darkness of the Belfast night, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable carnage. The killer's choice to wear the uniforms of the Royal Irish Constabulary was a deliberate and deeply sinister act. It was a key part of their plan, designed not just to commit murder, but to sow confusion, terror, and mistrust. In the Belfast of 1922, a knock on the door from the police was a frightening but not entirely unusual event. The RIC, along with the newly formed Ulster Special Constabulary, were conducting raids and arrests across the city, often in the dead of night. By dressing as policemen, the attackers ensured that the McMahons would open their door. It was a Trojan horse tactic, using the symbol of law and order to gain entry and carry out an act of lawless brutality. This deception served another, more chilling purpose. It was meant to send a message to the entire Catholic and nationalist community. If the police themselves could not be trusted, if the very men who were supposed to uphold the law were the ones breaking into homes and murdering people in their beds, then who could you turn to for protection? It created a profound sense of paranoia and helplessness. The massacre wasn't just an attack on one family. It was an attack on the community's sense of security. The use of official uniforms blurred the line between the state's security forces and the loyalist death squads that were operating in the city, suggesting they were one and the same. The motive for the massacre itself is believed to have been a direct reprisal. Just hours before the attack on the McMahon home, 2 members of the Ulster Special Constabulary had been killed by the IRA in Belfast. The McMahon massacre was seen by many as a retaliatory strike, a tit-for-tat killing of the most vicious kind. The victims were not chosen because they were IRA members. They weren't, but simply because they were Catholics, and prominent ones at that. They were symbolic targets, their deaths intended to terrorize the nationalist population and serve as a brutal warning against any further attacks on the security forces. It was a collective punishment, where an entire community was held responsible for the actions of a few. The attackers' cold efficiency and military-style precision also pointed towards a well-organized group, not a random mob. They knew who they were looking for, they had the uniforms and the weapons, and they executed their plan without hesitation. This level of organization fueled suspicions that this was not just a rogue gang, but a so-called murder gang operating with some level of official sanction, or at the very least, a blind eye from certain elements within the police force. The use of RIC uniforms was the ultimate act of psychological warfare, turning a symbol of state authority into a symbol of sectarian terror and leaving a deep and lasting scar on the city's psyche. The aftermath of the shooting in the McMahon's dining room was a scene of utter devastation. When the killers had fled, the surviving family members emerged to a nightmare. In the dimly lit room, 5 men lay dead or dying on the floor, riddled with bullets. The patriarch of the family, Owen McMahon, was among the dead. At 50 years old, the successful businessman who had built a comfortable life for his family was gone. His life's work and his role as a respected community figure had offered him no protection from the gunmen's sectarian rage. His death ripped the heart out of the family and the local Catholic business community. Alongside their father, 3 of his sons were also brutally murdered. Thomas, aged just 15, was the youngest victim, his life cut short before it had truly begun. Patrick, 24, and Frank, 22, were young men in the prime of their lives, working alongside their father and with their futures ahead of them. They were known as respectable lads, not involved in the political turmoil, yet they were killed simply for who they were. The fifth victim was Edward McKinney, an employee who worked as a barman in one of the McMahon family's pubs. He was staying with the family that night and was tragically in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another innocent life lost in the senseless violence. Miraculously, amid the carnage, there were survivors. One of Owen's sons, John McMahon, who was 21 at the time, was shot and badly wounded, but somehow survived the attack. He was left for dead by the killers, but managed to live, becoming a crucial witness to the horror that had unfolded. He would carry the physical and emotional scars of that night for the rest of his life. Another son, Bernard, was not in the house at the time of the attack, and he too was spared. The women of the family, including Owen's wife Eliza, were physically unharmed after being locked in another room, but they were left to discover the horrific scene and deal with the unimaginable grief of losing so many loved ones in one single violent act. The sole child survivor was a young boy, Michael, who was only 11 years old. He had managed to hide under a piece of furniture as the gunmen stormed through the house. He was not found by the killers and emerged physically unscathed but deeply traumatized by what he had heard and seen. He was left with the terrifying memory of the sounds of the attack and the sight of his murdered father and brothers. The family was shattered. In the space of a few minutes, a happy, prosperous household had been transformed into a house of death and mourning, its survivors left to pick up the pieces of their lives in a city that offered them no justice and no safety. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, the question on everyone's lips was, who did this? While the killers had worn police uniforms, suspicion quickly fell not on the RIC as a whole, but on a specific extreme faction within the police force in Belfast. This was a so-called murder gang, believed to be composed of members of the Ulster Special Constabulary and the most hardline elements of the RIC. This group was thought to be acting as a sectarian death squad, carrying out revenge killings against Catholics in response to IRA actions. The McMahon Massacre, with its cold-blooded and methodical execution, bore all the hallmarks of such a group. The motive was widely believed to be a direct reprisal. On the very day of the massacre, the IRA had killed 2 special constables in Belfast. The attack on the McMahon family, a prominent and visible Catholic family, was seen as a swift and brutal act of revenge. They were not targeted for any specific crime or political affiliation, but because they were Catholics who made for easy and symbolic victims. The message was clear. For every policeman killed, innocent Catholics would pay the price. This eye for an eye mentality was fueling a spiral of violence that was tearing the city apart, and the McMahon family were its most tragic victims. Whispers and intelligence reports circulating within the nationalist community and even among some British officials began to point the finger at a specific individual, District Inspector John William Nixon of the RIC. Nixon was a notoriously sectarian police officer, known for his extremist loyalist views and his fiery speeches denouncing Catholics and nationalists. He was the head of a special police unit, the Cromwell Club, which many believed was simply a front for the murder gang responsible for a series of sectarian killings in the city. His name became inextricably linked with the McMahon massacre, and he was widely seen in the Catholic community as the man who led the killers that night. Despite the widespread belief that a police gang was responsible, no one was ever brought to justice for the murders. The official investigation was a sham from the start. Evidence was lost or ignored, and key witnesses were not properly interviewed. The authorities seemed to have no interest in pursuing a case that might lead back to their own security forces. The Royal Ulster Constabulary, which replaced the RIC shortly after the massacre, was dominated by the same men who had served in the old forces, including the USC. There was no real appetite for an investigation that would expose the dark secrets of the state's own agents, leaving the survivors with no justice and the city with a festering wound of suspicion and mistrust. The name John William Nixon looms large over the story of the McMahon massacre, a figure shrouded in suspicion and controversy. Nixon was not just any police officer. He was a district inspector in the Royal Irish Constabulary, and a man known for his fervent, almost fanatical, loyalist and anti-Catholic sentiments. He was a powerful and influential figure within the police force in Belfast, and he made no secret of his extremist views. He was infamous for delivering inflammatory speeches, often to his fellow policemen, in which he encouraged them to take matters into their own hands and show no mercy to the enemy, by which he meant Catholics and nationalists. His rhetoric created a climate where acts of extreme violence were seen as not just acceptable but necessary. Suspicion fell on Nixon almost immediately. He was the leader of a group of hardline policemen, and it was widely believed that this group operated as a murder gang, carrying out assassinations of Catholics. The McMahon massacre fit the pattern of other sectarian killings that were attributed to his unit. The professionalism of the attack, the use of police uniforms, and the choice of a prominent Catholic family as a target all pointed towards an organized group operating with inside knowledge and a sense of impunity. For many in Belfast's nationalist community, there was no doubt that Nixon was the man who had orchestrated the massacre, if not personally pulled the trigger. The controversy surrounding Nixon deepened over the years. Despite the cloud of suspicion hanging over him, he was never charged with any crime related to the massacre. In fact, his career flourished. He was later promoted within the Royal Ulster Constabulary and eventually entered politics, becoming an independent unionist member of Parliament at Stormont. He used his political platform to continue his hardline rhetoric, becoming a hero to extremist loyalists and a figure of hate and fear for Catholics. His political success was seen as a slap in the face to the victims of sectarian violence, a sign that in the new state of Northern Ireland, men could get away with murder. Nixon was so confident in his position that he took legal action against anyone who publicly accused him of involvement in the McMahon murders. He successfully sued a Belfast newspaper for libel after it printed an article linking him to the crime. He won the case not because he proved his innocence, but because the newspaper could not produce the concrete, court-admissible evidence required to prove his guilt. This legal victory helped to officially clear his name, but it did little to change public opinion. For a generation of Belfast Catholics, and for many historians who have studied the period, John Nixon remains the prime suspect, a man who literally got away with murder and embodied the sectarian nature of the state at its birth. The McMahon massacre did not happen in a vacuum. It was the terrifying peak of a wave of violence and intimidation directed at the Catholic minority in Belfast and across the newly formed Northern Ireland. For middle-class Catholics in particular, the period was one of profound fear and uncertainty. They were caught in a terrible bind. Their relative success and prominence made them visible, and in the toxic sectarian atmosphere of the time, visibility made them targets. They were seen by loyalist extremists as symbols of a community that, in their eyes, did not belong in the new Protestant state. This made their homes, businesses, and lives incredibly vulnerable. The fear was constant and pervasive. It was the fear of a knock on the door in the middle of the night, just like the one the McMahons received. It was the fear of walking down the street, of going to work, of sending your children to school. Sectarian murders were becoming commonplace, and the perpetrators were rarely caught. Catholics felt that they had no one to turn to for protection. The police force, the RIC, and especially the B specials of the USC were seen not as neutral keepers of the peace, but as an armed wing of the unionist state, actively hostile to the Catholic community. The McMahon massacre seemed to confirm their worst fears. The state's security forces were not there to protect them, but to terrorize them. This atmosphere of terror had a devastating impact on the city. Thousands of Catholics fled their homes, seeking refuge in safer areas or leaving Belfast altogether. This period saw a huge population shift, as mixed neighborhoods were cleansed through violence and intimidation, leading to the creation of the rigidly segregated areas that would define Belfast for decades to come. Many Catholic-owned businesses were burned down or boycotted, and thousands of Catholic workers were driven out of their jobs in places like the shipyards in a campaign of sectarian intimidation known as the pogroms. The economic and social life of the Catholic community was crippled. The McMahon massacre became a powerful symbol of this persecution. The family was respectable, law-abiding, and not involved in politics, yet they were slaughtered in their own home. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. The message was chillingly effective. It crushed the spirit of many and created a deep and lasting sense of alienation from the new state of Northern Ireland. For generations of Catholics, the story of the McMahon family was a cautionary tale, a reminder of their vulnerability and of the sectarian violence that lay at the foundation of the state in which they were forced to live. It was a wound that would poison community relations for a century. In the days and weeks following the massacre, a wave of revulsion and horror swept across Ireland and beyond. The sheer brutality of the attack on the McMahon family shocked even a society that had become hardened to violence. The funeral for Owen McMahon and his sons was a massive public event, a solemn procession through the streets of Belfast, attended by thousands of mourners from all walks of life. It was a powerful display of community grief and solidarity, but it did little to ease the terror that had taken hold. The massacre had drawn a line in the sand, exposing the raw sectarian hatred that was driving the conflict in the north. For the surviving members of the McMahon family, life would never be the same. They had not only lost their beloved father and brothers, but they had also lost their home, their sense of security, and their faith in justice. The official investigation into the murders was a travesty. No serious effort was made to identify or apprehend the killers. The inquest returned an open verdict, a legal dead end. It was clear to the family and to the wider Catholic community that the authorities had no intention of holding their own men accountable. This denial of justice was a second wound, compounding the initial trauma and leaving a legacy of bitterness and mistrust. The political fallout was significant. The massacre put immense pressure on Michael Collins, the head of the provisional government in Dublin. He was trying to manage a fragile peace process and the transition to the Irish Free State, but the ongoing violence in the north was a major crisis. The McMahon massacre and other similar atrocities led Collins to believe that the Northern Ireland state was engaged in a systematic persecution of the nationalist minority. This hardened his stance and contributed to the breakdown of relations between the governments in Dublin and Belfast, further entrenching the political divisions on the island. The story of the massacre became a key part of the nationalist narrative of oppression in Northern Ireland. It was passed down through generations as proof of the sectarian nature of the state and its security forces. It served as a grim reminder that from its very inception, the state was built on a foundation of violence and discrimination against the Catholic minority. The failure to deliver justice for the McMahon family created a deep and abiding wound, a sense of grievance that would fester for decades. It was a symbol of a broken system, a wound that refused to heal and would continue to poison the well of community relations for the rest of the century. Today, more than a century after that terrible night in March 1922, the McMahon massacre remains a potent and painful memory in the history of Belfast. It is remembered not just as a single, horrific event, but as a symbol of the pogrom period, a time of intense sectarian violence that shaped the city and the new state of Northern Ireland. The story of the McMahon family's fate serves as a stark illustration of the vulnerability of the Catholic minority in those early years and the brutal methods that were used to establish and maintain the new political order. It is a cornerstone of the historical memory of the nationalist community. The massacre is still remembered because it represents a profound and lasting injustice. No one was ever convicted for the murders of Owen McMahon, his three sons, and their employee, Edward McKinney. The prime suspects, members of a police murder gang allegedly led by Inspector John Nixon, were protected by the state they served. This failure of justice has left a long shadow, reinforcing the nationalist community's deep-seated distrust of the state and its security forces for generations. The memory of the massacre became a rallying cry, a reminder of what was at stake in the long struggle for civil rights and equality in Northern Ireland. Over the years, the story has been kept alive through oral history, books and documentaries. Historians have pieced together the events of that night, confirming what many suspected all along, that this was a targeted assassination carried out by a state-sponsored death squad as a sectarian reprisal. Remembering the massacre is not about reopening old wounds for the sake of it. It is about acknowledging the truth of the past. For a society to move forward, it must first have an honest understanding of how it was formed, including its darkest and most painful chapters. The McMahon massacre is one of those essential, though terrible, truths, A century on, the names of the victims are still honored. Memorials and commemorations ensure that they are not forgotten. Their story is a sobering lesson about the dangers of sectarian hatred and the devastating human cost of political violence. It reminds us that behind the grand sweep of history are ordinary families like the McMahons, whose lives were shattered by forces beyond their control. Remembering their tragedy is an act of defiance against the silence and impunity that surrounded their murders. It is a way of finally giving them the recognition and justice that was so brutally denied to them 100 years ago, ensuring that their story and its lessons are never lost to time.